somewhere along the way, a marriage that once looked like it belonged on the cover of a glossy magazine started behaving like a reality show that kept recording long after everyone assumed the cameras had stopped. And now, years into one of the most photographed, analyzed, and quietly whispered about relationships in modern American public life, late-night television has stopped treating it like a sensitive subject requiring careful handling and started treating it like an ongoing case study in public awkwardness that just keeps adding new material at a pace nobody in the writing rooms can quite keep up with. Jimmy Kimmel did not just lift the curtain a little. He pulled it back far enough that the whole setup started to look like it might need to be rebuilt from scratch. Start with what makes this specific comedic territory so unusual, because it is worth understanding before getting into the individual moments. Most marriages involving public figures exist at a comfortable distance from serious comedic scrutiny. The standard arrangement is that the personal life stays personal, and even when it briefly enters public conversation, it does so on the couple's terms, with messaging prepared and optics managed and the whole presentation shaped carefully before it reaches any one screen. The image gets constructed in advance, and the public receives the finished version. That arrangement requires both parties to be operating from the same script. What Kimmel and the broader late-night landscape have been pointing at, with increasing consistency and decreasing diplomatic cushioning, is the persistent visual evidence that Trump and Melania are not always operating from the same script. Or if they are reading different pages. The hand-holding that looks optional. The smiles that arrive on a slight delay, like someone hit the button a second after they were supposed to. The shared appearances that occasionally carry the energy of two people who found out at the last minute they were booked for the same event and decided not to cancel rather than actually choosing to be there together. None of this requires wild speculation. The footage exists. It circulates. People replay it. And what keeps the conversation going is not invented drama, but the steady accumulation of small, visible moments that simply refuse to disappear quietly into the background no matter how many news cycles pass over them. The correspondence dinner sequence is where Kimmel's approach found its sharpest recent expression, and the circumstances surrounding it added layers that the jokes themselves did not need to manufacture. The dinner had replaced its traditional comedian host with a mentalist. This was not a subtle signal. The White House Correspondents' Dinner has featured a comedian for decades, and the tradition exists specifically because the format of political satire performed in front of the people being satirized carries a particular cultural weight that no other format replicates. Replacing that format with mind reading, in an era when the political environment has become almost satirically resistant to being satirized, was a kind of institutional decision that generates more commentary in the replacing than any comedian could have generated in the performing. Kimmel's response was to run his own version on his show 3 days before the event. Tuxedo, simulated luminaries, archive footage of Trump, Vance, Melania, Pete Hegseth, Kid Rock, Vanilla Ice. The full cast assembled from the archive and projected into a fictional dinner that was in many ways more honest about the dinner's actual function than the dinner itself was planning to be. His opening line about the president not wanting jokes made, but also not wanting to pay him $130,000 to stay quiet landed the way it landed because the reference was real, the lawsuit was real, the number was real, and the only thing fictional about the joke was the framing. When the underlying fact is that documented, the comedy does not need to exaggerate. It just needs a point. The mushroom reference that followed operated on the same principle. Brief, specific, sourced. The kind of line that does not need a setup because the setup already exists in the public record and everyone in the audience had already done the work of connecting it before the punchline arrived. The expectant widow line is worth its own examination because the reaction it generated said more about the current atmosphere than the joke itself did. Kimmel called Melania beautiful, said she had the glow of an expectant widow, and moved on. It was a joke about the age gap between Trump, who is in his late 70s, and Melania, who is younger than Kimmel himself. Standard roast territory. The kind of material that has appeared at every correspondence dinner for decades in some form or another, directed at every president and every first lady, without generating the particular response this one produced. Melania called for Kimmel to be fired. He addressed it directly and with the specific kind of calm that comes from someone who has thought about how to respond before the moment arrived. He said it was a light roast joke about age difference, and explicitly not what was being characterized as. He acknowledged that the event she referenced had been genuinely frightening and that trauma does not require a body count to be real. He said we should come together and reject hateful rhetoric. And then he added the line that became the sharpest moment of the entire segment. He said a great place to start that conversation would be with her husband. The structure of that response is worth pausing on because it demonstrated something about how effective political comedy works at its best. He did not dismiss the complaint. He did not escalate the insult. He took the stated concern seriously, agreed with the principle behind it, and then applied that principle in the direction it most obviously pointed. The result was a response that sounded completely reasonable and was completely devastating at the same time. The birthday joke landed in a register that several of Kimmel's Trump-adjacent lines never quite reach, which is a specific register of quiet sadness underneath the humor. She's planning to celebrate at home the same way she always does, looking out a window and whispering, "What have I done?" The laugh it produced was genuine and immediate, but the joke does not fully belong to the comedy category. It belongs to something slightly different. A portrait, an observation about a person who has been photographed and filmed and analyzed for nearly a decade, but who still somehow feels opaque, still somehow feels like someone whose actual interior experience of her own life remains almost entirely unknown to the people who have been watching it from the outside. The Rotten Tomatoes line about her documentary was standard roast material and worked on its own terms. The 10% critical score was real, making the joke almost entirely factual with a single editorial addition for color. But the birthday window line operated differently because it did not ask for a laugh as much as it invited a specific kind of recognition. The recognition that comes from looking at a situation and thinking, regardless of politics, regardless of judgment, that looks genuinely difficult. Kimmel is careful not to linger in that register because lingering would turn the comedy into something else entirely. But he visits it regularly enough that the portrait he has assembled over years of material has more texture than simple mockery. There is something in his Trump-Melania commentary that functions like careful observation as much as comedy, noting contradictions, flagging inconsistencies, and occasionally pausing at the moments that are harder to make funny because they are too real to exaggerate. The robot entrance of Melania's AI Education Summit produced one of the cleaner visual comedy moments in recent Kimmel history, precisely because it required almost no editorial intervention. One of those robots is Melania. The joke worked because the footage of Melania's entrance alongside an actual humanoid robot, in an environment devoted to artificial intelligence and the future of technology, created a visual juxtaposition that the internet was always going to notice, and the internet was always going to run with. Kimmel simply named what everyone watching was already thinking before they had finished thinking it. This is a recurring pattern in his Trump-adjacent material. Not invention, but identification. Not exaggeration, but precision. The moment he is pointing at is already there. His contribution is the timing of when to point, how long to let it sit, and when to move on before the observation collapses into itself. The summit itself, devoted to fostering the future together and functioning largely as a promotional vehicle for AI and education, was a kind of initiative that generates genuine questions about depth and purpose regardless of who organized it. The robot visual elevated those questions into comedy, without requiring any of them to be stated directly. The King Charles sequence brought a different dimension into the conversation because it introduced a specific dynamic of Trump in an international setting where the power structure around him operates by entirely different rules than the ones he is accustomed to controlling. Kimmel's observation that Trump loves being alongside royalty because it provides the experience of watching historically important people defer to him captured something true about how Trump relates to prestige and recognition. The golden gift with his name on it arrived as confirmation of a pattern that has appeared across every significant state visit and diplomatic encounter of his presidency. The aesthetic of significance matters as much as the substance of significance. A large gold object bearing the Trump name communicates the right things in the right register, regardless of what it actually represents. The submarine alliance joke was a kind of historical callback that works in a late-night room full of people who appreciate being given credit for knowing the reference. It did not need to be explained, which meant everyone who caught it felt rewarded, and everyone who missed it did not feel excluded because the visual joke about the golden gift was carrying the segment independently. What the King Charles material revealed, somewhat unexpectedly, was how much of the Trump public image is about performing at a specific altitude. The validation of royalty, of old money, of historic institutions, of things that carry weight independent of any deal or transaction or election, functions as a category of approval that Trump has always appeared to find particularly meaningful. Kimmel notices this and notices it without excessive editorializing, which is why the observation lands as comedy rather than lecture. The Epstein references that have appeared throughout Kimmel's recent material operate at a different temperature than the other topics, and that temperature requires a different kind of handling. The Jeffrey Epstein introduction joke, placing Trump and Melania as strangers meeting through Epstein, was deliberately dark and deliberately brief. It produced a specific kind of laugh that comes with visible discomfort attached, the audience acknowledging the reference, while the reference simultaneously acknowledging that this is not entirely comfortable territory. The Ghislaine-Maxwell sequence moved deeper into that discomfort with a structure that was less purely comedic and more clearly political. The suggested arc of a pardon, a testimony that exonerates Trump, a release from what had been functionally a comfortable arrangement dressed as imprisonment, and the observation that all the horrible people live, was not a joke at its center. It was a prediction dressed in comedic framing. The humor was in a resigned certainty of the delivery, not outrage at what might happen, but the exhausted recognition of how these situations tend to resolve. Kimmel has a specific tone he uses for material in this category that is worth identifying. It is not the energetic delivery he uses for absurdist Trump humor. It is quieter, flatter, and more direct. The effect is to signal to the audience that he is no longer performing quite as much, that the distance between the comedian and the commentary is narrowed to something close to zero, and that what is being said because it needs to be said rather than because it produces a satisfying laugh. The audience responds to that shift differently than they respond to the lighter material, not with less engagement, but with a different kind of engagement, more attentive, more willing to sit with something that does not resolve neatly. The old 2010 footage of Trump enthusiastically declaring his love for Jimmy Kimmel at a Samsung promotional event, offering to come on the show, pressing a handshake, performing generosity and warmth for a camera at a corporate event, functions as a kind of historical footnote that Kimmel has returned to occasionally and that gains a different quality each time it reappears. It is not being used to suggest hypocrisy in any simple sense. It is being used to document the passage from a relationship that was publicly warm and uncomplicated to a relationship that currently involves the First Lady calling for Kimmel's firing over a mild roast joke about age difference. The distance between those two moments is not commented on directly. It does not need to be. The footage from 2010 and the footage from the present sit next to each other, and the distance speaks for itself. This is a long game version of what Kimmel does best. Not the single joke that lands and moves on, but the accumulation of material over years that begins to tell a story larger than any individual segment. The portrait that assembles itself gradually from individual moments until it becomes something that cannot be easily dismissed because it is built entirely from documented evidence that nobody disputes. What makes all of this worth analyzing beyond the individual jokes is what it reveals about how comedy functions as political observation in an environment where conventional political commentary has largely exhausted its own tools. The press can document, analysts can interpret, historians can contextualize, but comedy can do something none of those disciplines do quite as efficiently, which is to take the gap between image and reality, place both sides of that gap in the same frame, and let the audience see the distance without being told what to conclude from it. Kimmel's Trump-Melania material works because it never fully commits to a single explanation. It does not tell you what the marriage is. It shows you what the marriage looks like in the moments it chooses not to perform. It identifies the beats where the script slips and something unrehearsed shows through. It notices the details that manage to sit in plain sight for years without being clearly named. And then it names them with a joke, a pause, occasionally a line that carries more weight than a laugh track can fully absorb. The relationship between those two people will continue to generate material for as long as both remain in public life, not because anything about it is definitively knowable, but because the gap between the image and the visible reality keeps producing moments that refuse to disappear. Each new appearance adds another piece. Each new controversy reframes the pieces already assembled. The puzzle keeps building. The cameras keep rolling, and Kimmel keeps watching.